Our scripture reading for this morning comes from the book of Luke, chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. Some who were present on that occasion told Jesus about the Galileans whom Pilate had killed while they were offering sacrifices. He replied, "Do you think the suffering of these Galileans proved that they were more sinful than all the other Galileans? No. I tell you, but unless you change your hearts and lives, you will die just as they did. What about those 18 people who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them? Do you think that they were more guilty of wrongdoing than everyone else who lives in Jerusalem? No. I tell you, but unless you change your hearts and lives, you will die just as they did." Jesus told this parable. A man owned a fig tree planted in his vineyard. He came looking for fruit on it and found none. He said to his gardener, "Look, I've come looking for fruit on this fig tree for the past 3 years, and I've never found any. Cut it down. Why should it continue depleting the soil's nutrients?" The gardener responded, "Lord, give it 1 more year, and I will dig around it and give it fertilizer. Maybe it will produce fruit next year. If not, then you can cut it down." Here ends the lesson. May God transform understanding into action. Amen.
A couple of weeks ago, I had the pleasure of visiting a couple of our congregants in their home. I'd never been to their home. Now, some of you, I've had the pleasure to spend some time with you in your own context. It's always a little different to get to know someone in their own environment, in their natural habitat, so to speak. But while I was there, and we talked about a lot of things, I was there for a couple of hours, one of the things that these congregants mentioned was that they were working on some remodeling projects in one of the bathrooms. And just the mention of that remodeling project caused another person to groan and say, "Oh, the jacuzzi." And then that person started to groan, and it was like a chain reaction. And I said, "Explain the jacuzzi situation. Clearly this is touching a nerve." And they said, "Well, what do you know about jacuzzis?" Really don't know anything about jacuzzis other than my grandmother, growing up on my mom's side of the family, had a jacuzzi. It was her home. She built it. The plan was hers, and that jacuzzi was a point of pride for her. So that was my only exposure to jacuzzis, and I didn't really have a particular connection to that jacuzzi, so what's the big deal? And they said, "Well, ask any contractor, and they'll tell you that a couple of decades ago, jacuzzis were all the rage in these bigger homes and in suburban-style homes as a selling point, as a kind of luxury item that you could use then when you were selling the house or the blueprints or whatever, as a kind of, hey, you're really living the life now." But as decades passed and time went on, that luxury item suddenly became an inconvenience. And now, at least according to their contractor friends, they take out at least one of these things a week. And so at this point, they're more trouble than they're worth. And that made me think about my grandmother's jacuzzi because, interestingly enough, she was really proud of it, but she almost never used it. And the last time I was in my grandmother's house, now granted this was a few years ago, so things may have changed, but the last time I was there, it was now a closet. I mean, the jacuzzi was still there, but they were just sort of using it as a closet, and they'd put a curtain up over it, like, you know what, we're just not even going to talk about that decade. It makes me think about conspicuous consumption, the idea of what we use, the things that we think we're going to need that we suddenly find we don't need later. This Lenten season, we've spent some time talking about what it means to jettison something that's maybe getting in our way, or perhaps was once helpful, but is no longer helpful. And so we have to have a kind of come to Jesus moment with ourselves, and that's kind of what Lent is for. Lent is this work of, okay, where am I at? Can I take stock of what I did last year, what I hope to do this year, and more importantly, where am I currently? In hopes of identifying some of those problem areas and jettisoning them. But it's not easy work. I had the jacuzzi thing on my mind, and so I went home after that conversation and I was Googling jacuzzis. Now, jacuzzi, you may know this already, but jacuzzi is kind of like Kleenex. It's technically a brand name for something that exists independently of the company. Did we know this? Is this general knowledge? Maybe this is just me. But hot tubs, motorized hot tubs, were not invented by the Jacuzzi company. And in fact, the Jacuzzi company didn't even start out producing jacuzzis. It may surprise you to learn that the Jacuzzi brothers were Italian-American immigrants, the Jacuzzis, Giacomo and his 6 other brothers. Maybe they were Italian. They came to this country and started a family business making airplane propellers. It wasn't actually until the 50s that there was a shift. The company had been shrinking, and there was eventually a shift in the company. But why hot tub spas? Why bubbly motorized pools? Well, it turns out that one of the Jacuzzi brothers had a son who at a very young age was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. And at the time, hydrotherapy, essentially getting into some warm water, bubbling water, kind of the hot spring effect, was all the rage. And so this Jacuzzi brother decided, I think I can duplicate that experience in the home so that people can have access to what was essentially at the time medical treatment. I mean, spas like this existed, but they were actually more popular in places like Japan than in the West. And they certainly weren't considered a household item. Well, in the late 60s, the jacuzzi launches, but it isn't really until the 70s that it takes off as this symbol of not hydrotherapy, not getting better, but of status. Suddenly, everybody's throwing in jacuzzis into their homes. All the plans have jacuzzis. These McMansions are all being thrown up with jacuzzi this, jacuzzi this, jacuzzi this. And now suddenly we have all these jacuzzis we don't need. And this thing that was this kind of interesting story about a man trying to help his son has now become this sort of luxury item for a certain generation that's desperately saddled with this stuff it can't get rid of. You may wonder how this connects to Jesus at all. I mean, we've talked about getting rid of distractions. In this particular case, I think you would agree a jacuzzi counts as a distraction. But I want to take it a little step further today because I actually think that Jesus and jacuzzis have a lot in common in terms of how we experience our faith as American Christians. And I want to kind of explore some of that today. Let's look at some of the parallels. American Protestant Christianity, particularly following the Second World War, was designed, patently designed, and the United Church of Christ was a big part of this when we were founded in 1957, was patently designed to be a way for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to organize themselves into groups, social groups, collectives, following the realization that maybe all of this Christian division that we've had is not for the best. The Second World War kind of expanded the American Protestant horizon a bit. And so then the project after the Second World War was building American Protestant institutions that essentially reflected our values and would essentially, we hoped, avoid the atrocities of the Second World War again. Which is why we start seeing a lot of this values voters rhetoric. That was one of the potential sort of forms that it took. In progressive Christianity, in the Congregationalist sort of world, it took the form of activist movements. There was a lot of work around racial justice and reconciliation, but it was still relatively small. And so, for the most part, what you ended up with by the, let's say, the 70s, was American Christianity as this institution that maybe started out as a humble enterprise, a way of helping people connect to God, and now it's an industry, a cottage industry that is a sign of status as much as need. The development, and it's really interesting when you really think about the rise of certain trends in American Christianity, all of which were supposed to save us. Christian music as an alternative to secular music, Christian movies as an alternative to secular movies. The idea essentially of an alternative Christian subculture that you could plug into and hide from reality so that you don't have to think about anything is one of the potential solutions, particularly that the moral majority in the 80s proposed. Well, we'll just hide from reality. Global warming, not an issue. Race relations, not my problem. Poverty, healthcare, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, bucko. And while you're at it, be sure to donate so that we can build another gigantic monstrosity that we use twice a week. And the reality is, we can get really, really smug as a smaller church, looking at a bigger church and saying, oof, we are so much more authentic than they are. We've got it so much more together. And maybe that's true. I mean, sometimes that can definitely be true. That corporate polish robs Christianity of its soul. I believe that. And I think we're seeing that sort of the death of the megachurch thing is already kind of well on its way. I realize that's controversial. That's okay. We look at the numbers, the churches are shrinking. Christian music as an industry didn't save us. The GOP didn't save us. And so the big elephant in the room is that the church struggles with relevancy in the 21st century because there are real problems that people are trying to solve. And we're over here having conversations nobody cares about anymore. Our institutions, our status, the size of our churches, our stadium seating, and our lighting. Or alternatively, the small church trap of getting so caught in our bubble and convincing ourselves that as a small church that somehow makes us better in some way automatically, and that gets us lazy too. Lots of jacuzzis in our world. Lots of opportunities for good things to be corrupted, for things that were maybe once beneficial to get twisted, for things that we thought we needed, for us to suddenly look at them and say, why am I carrying this around again? For a lot of people, Christianity is simply just a way to preserve their own demographics. To a certain extent, I acknowledge that as a Christian minister in America in the 21st century, that by trying to convince someone to attend church, sort of a potential double-edged sword there. Because the dominant narrative in terms of American Christianity, at least as most of us tend to experience it, is incredibly toxic. And I don't want to contribute to that. However, indirectly, just by encouraging people to, I don't know, go to church as sort of a blanket thing, or pursue a life of faith as sort of a blanket thing. Ideas have consequences. I'm not necessarily sure I want to give free license to just explore and believe and practice however you want just because it feels good. And that's the other thing, too, about this sort of Jacuzzi Jesus mentality, is it feels really good. It's super validating because I've got a jacuzzi and my neighbors don't. I've got this thing that I can point to that isn't just a thing that I've somehow managed to acquire. It defines me now. It describes me more than just, yeah, that's a thing I own. It almost owns me. It's so tempting to stick a toe in that water and say, you know, maybe I'll rip it out this year, but just one more bath. We have lots of jacuzzis in our world, friends. I don't know, and I won't presume to tell you what your jacuzzis might be. I know what mine are, at least some of them. In the process of writing a sermon like this, it's almost impossible not to if you're being honest with yourself, try to identify some of your own jacuzzis. Those things that you think are so important. Bulletin covers. You're laughing. That was like 6 months of trauma, getting those bulletin covers perfect, and then realizing we weren't going to be able to print in color. Are you kidding me? It really doesn't matter. I mean, it really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. I want our bulletins to look nice. When people come in the door, I want our bulletins to look nice. I want our sanctuary to look nice. When they visit our website, I want that to look nice. I want our social media to look relatively polished. I want all of those things. None of them matter if ultimately I'm carrying around all this dead weight. So wherever you are, whatever your jacuzzis are this week, I encourage you to begin identifying them. But I'm going to leave you with this point. You'll notice at the end of the scripture today, when Jesus, using this sort of metaphor of this tree that maybe or maybe not bears fruit, Jesus allows one more year, essentially a test run, to see if it's possible to reinvigorate the tree. So what I would encourage you to do this week, as you begin to identify your jacuzzis, some of you may be like me, you get really enthusiastic and then you want to throw everything out all at once. I'm OCD. That's my first, no, I'm serious. I'm clinically OCD. My first default, whether I'm on medication or seeing a therapist or not, is to spin to the extreme. I'm going to take on the world. And then I drink the waterfall and I get burned out. So don't do that. If you need an excuse, point to the scripture this week. Jesus gave the tree another year. Maybe you need to give that jacuzzi another year to see if it's actually taking up space or if it can be appropriated into something useful. Be patient, that's okay. Part of the practice of Lent is waiting, not just doing. But hopefully, as we do this, and as we build a church in a world that, my God, is a little more authentic, a little less corporate, a little less polished, a little less pre-digested, my hope is that we'll all tear out these jacuzzis, not just out of spite, but frankly, so we can make more room. More room for you, more room for me, more room for everybody. Amen.